Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. So today is going to be really all about you and making sure that you get your questions answered as we approach this important obligation deadline with state and local fiscal recovery funds. We're joined by our incredible partner, Matt Hansen from Wood O'Brien, who, for those of you who have been attending other federal assistance E301 webinars know has been an expert guide at navigating on the spot questions. The way that we are going to run today's session is we're going to provide some thoughts at the top, and then we'll really just start going through the questions that you pre-submitted. If you have additional follow-up questions after you get an answer, please feel free to ask those. We want to make sure that we fully answer questions that come up today. And then if we think it needs, a deeper dive, we can figure out making time for that. So with that, I'll pass it over to Matthew Hansen.
Appreciate it, Jamie, and I appreciate the U.S. Conference of Mayors and Bloomberg to continue to support this effort. I know it's the last thing municipal leaders want to be doing right now as we go into the winter holidays is focusing on an obligation deadline, but that's where we're at. And for those of you that were involved with the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund, it's eerily similar to where we were a couple years ago. I just want to highlight that this is a documentation deadline. So the requirement to meet the obligation standard by 12/31/24 is to have the documents in your files. It is not a reporting deadline. There's nothing you need to upload or submit to Treasury by 12/31/24. You need to have the documentation in your file. So proof that a contract was made, subaward, beneficiary agreement, that you have your estimate of personnel cost or interagency agreements. So really critical to focus on the documents you have from previous obligations, the documents that you need to put together to meet these obligations, and not so much about the reporting deadline. We will certainly get there in January for quarterly reporters and April for annual reporters. And I know, Treasury has sent out a lot of emails focusing on the reporting, but that's not the deadline requirement right now. It is a documentation deadline to meet obligation by 12/31/24. The other thing I want to talk about is this obligation deadline applies to your allocated funds. So the money you were allocated to by Treasury, if over the last several years you've also earned interest, that interest is not considered program funding. That interest does not have federal flow down requirements and does not need to be obligated by 12/31/24. So that interest is, for all intents and purposes, it is general fund, can be handled as general fund. So when we're talking about the 12/31/24 obligation deadline, it is really what was allocated to you in the two tranches from Treasury. I know people would hope that we will get a last minute extension of the obligation deadline. Unfortunately, the 12/31/24 obligation deadline and 12/31/26 expenditure deadlines are actually written into the ARPA legislation. So at this point, it would take an act of Congress to get those dates to be extended. So unfortunately, a last minute extension of these deadlines is not coming our way. So with that, I'll kick it back to Jamie to run through some questions, but please feel free to take yourself off mute, to add additional questions in the chat to make this as beneficial to you as possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. All right, we're going to start with Corinne Peppers from Porter, Indiana. And she was asking about what's the proper way to obligate funds to public safety expenses. How can we reclassify funds to payroll after 12/31/24?
So great question. And I think there's a couple other questions, similar flavor. If it is a payroll expense that has already happened, both the obligation and the expense happens at the time that payroll is processed by your jurisdiction. So if we're talking about how do I prove obligation for payroll that's already happened, it is general ledger, it is something from your payroll system, it is a time and effort reporting. Uh, so that's taken care of. It's really the prospective, the payroll that will happen after 12/31/24. And the cleanest and simplest way to do it is through an interagency agreement or MOU. So to have your mayor, city administrator, whoever has signing authority to enter into an interagency agreement with either the police department or your HR department that says X amount of ARPA funds will be obligated for the purposes of public safety payroll up to this amount. So at this point, that interagency agreement is really the proper way to obligate that funding for payroll.
Great. I'm going to ask a maybe related question from Kate. Actually, first, sorry. Corinne, did that answer your question? Or do you have anything to follow up?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So my concern is that we have a stormwater project that we have already contracted for earlier this year. We're waiting on some drawing changes in a change order and the utility company to move gas mains sometime next year, but they haven't actually committed to doing that. So the reason I ask about obligating payroll expenses properly is a safeguard, if you will, that if for some reason the stormwater project can't be completed and paid out, in the next 2 years, I don't want to give $300,000 back to the government. I want to say, no, we obligated that to payroll also.
Yep, 100%, and a really smart strategy that you are thinking of and going down that road. I think most people would understand that when your jurisdiction's budget is approved for the fiscal year, there's a FTE headcount that's approved, and you could point to that and say, we obligated, those personnel costs at the time that budget was adopted by the city. But Treasury hasn't gone that far with us yet. So I would recommend, just because you have an interagency agreement doesn't mean it ever has to be liquidated with ARPA funds. If you don't realize that cost savings from that other project, you'll continue to pay those public safety payroll with general fund. But having that interagency agreement creates a valid obligation, so gives you the flexibility to move money down the road if need be.
Okay, thank you.
Great. The next question was from Caitlin Fitzgerald of Talbot County, Maryland. Caitlin asked, the county has an interagency agreement with the county sanitary department for a sewer extension project. We have budgeted and obligated with an interagency agreement, $400K of this project. If we end up coming in under budget, can we reobligate the funds to another project purchase that was paid, ordered, or contracted for prior to 12/31/24? For instance, if 30K of the original sanitary project obligation remains as of July 1st, 2025, can we use the remaining 30K on an ambulance that was ordered or paid for on November 30th, 24, since the order or payment was done before the obligation deadline?
So the short answer is yes. Treasury FAQ 17.16 talks about strategies for moving money around after the 12/31/24 obligation deadline. It is a lot easier if it's revenue loss provision of government services funds, because not all of the OMB 2 CFR uniform guidance requirements follows that money. But it is something you can do with all pots of money. You need to have another project with a valid obligation that happened, before 12/31/24. So the contract to purchase an ambulance certainly would meet that obligation standard. You would just need to make sure that, in this case, the ambulance was procured in such a way as to meet the Treasury ARPA requirements. But if you've met those requirements, then absolutely, and really appreciate Treasury giving us the flexibility to mutually agree to cancel projects and move money to another project, to cover cost overruns from a project, and to move money from one project to another, just as long as they've been obligated by 12/31/24. So, Caitlin, you should be in good shape.
Did that answer the question fully for you, Caitlin?
Yes, thank you so much.
Of course. Great. The next question is from Erica Lujan from Santa Fe, New Mexico. How do you verify if your city reported revenue loss? Are there specific disclaimers that need to be attached to our contracts?
So the way you verify if your city claimed a revenue loss is in the Treasury reporting portal. So whoever from your jurisdiction has access to the Treasury reporting portal, you can go in, look at a previous report, and see if the appropriate boxes have been checked. On the Treasury State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund website, they also have access to their Power BI data, and you can look at it there. But the easiest thing is to look in the reporting portal. Again, at this point, how it was reported really doesn't matter. It's making sure you have obligations satisfied by 12/31/24. And then as far as disclaimers that need to be attached to your contracts, not anything specific to revenue loss, but you should include in those contract vehicles the source of this funding, that it is, federal Treasury ARPA funding, and the vendor contractor will be subject to any reporting or other compliance requirements, but nothing specific to revenue loss. But your contract should be using a federal template, or let them know that federal funding is involved.
Does that answer your question?
Looks like there's a thumbs up.
Yes,
Great.
thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Great. The next question is from Reina Cabrera. Reina had asked, is it necessary for me to obligate the funds that have already been expended but reported incorrectly? I don't know if that's one where it would be helpful to get a little more information.
If the expenses have already occurred by 12/31/24, then in some way, shape, or another, an obligation occurred. But now is when you'd want to go back and really just, do a self-monitoring of your own documentation to make sure that you have in your files, a copy of whatever that original obligation was and the corresponding expense report. So if it was something that you acquired, through a purchase order or a contract, or payroll expenses, you don't have to re-obligate the money or do anything, but you want to make sure you have that documentation in place. And if for some reason you're missing documentation of an obligation, or you thought something had been a fully executed agreement and it wasn't, like, now is the time to do a placeholder obligation, to make sure you're not returning any funding to the feds because of a paperwork or a documentation issue. As far as reporting incorrectly, again, we'll get to that during the next open period. But really a good practice, good idea right now is to self-monitor yourself, even have a colleague take a look at your files and make sure you have documents that justify all the previous obligations and expenses that have occurred.
Reina, does that answer your question?
I just have a follow-up.
Great.
So I wouldn't have to worry about obligating the current balance on the account right now? Like, because we expended the funds already for payroll? As long as I have the documentation, it's okay. We won't have to return the funds that are showing us a balance on our account.
Yeah, because it's you won't have an opportunity to update your account until the next time the reporting window opens. Treasury has sent out those letters telling people that they have X amount in jeopardy, but from a reporting portal perspective, there's nothing you can do at this point until, the next window opens. So for 12/31/24, you need to just make sure you have the documentation in your own files. And if you've used all the money for payroll, the obligation and expense happens at the same time when that payroll hits. So as long as, ultimately how your single auditor or treasury or anybody else is going to determine if the money was fully obligated or not, it's going to be by a review of your documents and your files and not by reviewing data that's in the treasury reporting portal.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Next, we'll go to a question from Cynthia Lapkins. I'm new to the township. Want to make sure I'm processing everything correctly. Cynthia, do you want to add anything onto that for context?
I'm sorry, I just joined. Say that again.
I saw the question that you had submitted was, I'm new to the township. I want to make sure I'm processing everything correctly. Is there something a little more specific you were hoping to learn today, or just get some general advice on where to get started?
Okay, yeah, so we just don't even know how to obligate at all. We know that we definitely have used ARPA funds, but just want some direction on how to go about making sure we're compliant in obligating those. So I don't know if there's somebody that maybe I can talk to directly, or if we can get, some kind of guidance, because we're totally clueless here, because we have the fiscal officer is new and I'm new as well, which I'm the assistant fiscal officer. So we just don't know what to do with these ARPA funds.
So the 12/31/24 obligation deadline is a document deadline. So Cynthia, if you believe you've already expended some or all of the money, you're going to want to look through, the accounting system, your general ledger, whatever the case might be, to see if there are, fully executed contracts, subawards, beneficiary agreements, payroll records, or interagency agreements. That's all that needs to happen by the end of the year. You don't need to go in and update anything in the reporting portal or worry about anything else. So you need to do a little bit of a mining of the records you've inherited and see, what has been documented, what hasn't been documented. And if you're finding that there are, gaps in those records, and you might not be able to demonstrate, a correlation between the ARPA funds and obligations and expenditures that have happened previously, then my best advice is to enter into an interagency agreement from, the mayor, the manager's office to your office that says, up to whatever you think the remaining balance of ARPA funds is for, personnel cost or something along that line. And you have that obligation in your back pocket in case it turns out that you do have a gap in your documents. But step one is really, don't focus on what's in the reporting portal. Don't focus on, a letter you might have gotten, an email you might have gotten from Treasury. Focus on the documents you have, and that you can demonstrate that obligations occurred up to your total ARPA award.
Okay.
And Cynthia, if it's helpful to schedule any one-on-one time to go over this more in depth, just let us know.
Okay, I sure will. Thank you.
Great. Next up is Vicki Edwards. Vicki, you had asked a question I think we've addressed at this point, but want to see if you have anything to add. Our borough has spent all of our funds. Can it all be reported in the next filing, or must all years be corrected?
And the short answer is your treasury reporting is cumulative. So whatever cleanup, catch up, aggregate, would just be in your next report. So you don't need to go back to previous reports and make any adjustments or corrections. It would all just be updated in your next report. You have the ability to report total obligations, total expenditures versus obligations and expenditures during this period. And that's where you can do all the cleanup you need from previous reporting cycles.
I think we're coming up on some of our last of the pre-submitted questions. So if you have other questions, feel free to start either raising your hand or coming off mute. John Kinsley from Easton, Pennsylvania had asked, is there any chance an extension to the date will be passed by Congress? Matt, I think you addressed this in the introduction, but just want to circle back to it again, just to sort of clearly say that we don't anticipate that. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I know we weren't anticipating it with the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund, and it happened at the 11th hour. But Treasury had administrative authority in the legislation to make that extension with the ARPA, state and local fiscal recovery. They don't have the administrative authority to do it. It would take an act of Congress, and obviously with the election and the transition, they don't even have a full budget for the next fiscal year, let alone going back and modifying legislation like ARPA.
Does anyone have any additional questions? Give me a second to come off mute. Great. Well, oh, Caitlin Fitzgerald.
Hi, yes. So we had a webinar from NACO today, and we were talking about personnel costs, and they kept referring to FAQ 212, which was more public safety and health and direct costs for that. So my title is grants clerk, and we also have a grants administrator, and we wanted to use those salaries for personnel costs. And we found in FAQ 1710, I felt like it would fit that because it's additional personnel costs, legal and administrative. Is that still okay? Or is it just the FAQ 212?
No, you're exactly right. And it actually starts with FAQ 17.7 and continues through several others. And they've specifically, not only in the FAQs, but also the obligation interim final rule talked about how you can obligate and expend funds on grant administration, legal, single audit, reporting, all of those things you need to do to actually administer the ARPA grant. Again, for expenses, payroll expenses that happened before 12/31/24, obligation expenditures already occurred. Beyond that, there's two methods for obligating. One is the estimation strategy that is laid out in 17.7 and the continuing FAQs, where you estimate what those costs will be over the next 2 years. The other one is, just doing an interagency agreement, allocating up to X amount for, grant administration cost. But is it allowable? 1,000%. Those public safety, public health, expenditure categories, that's a programmatic activity versus an administrative activity. So you're good to go. It's just a matter of how you want to demonstrate the obligation, either using the estimate approach or the interagency agreement approach.
Right. And then to piggyback on that, and I know we've been focusing on like the obligations, so not so much as the reporting, but in the previous reporting periods, we kind of lumped it all into administrative costs. And NACO had kind of said, putting them like individualized, like making it an X amount, like for each position, basically. Is there a right or wrong way to do that, or not really?
I think what, and apologize, wasn't on the NACO call, but I think when you're talking about programmatic expenses, you're talking about the, public health costs, public safety costs, et cetera. Each of those should be done as its own project, because they have different programmatic purposes, and Treasury is collecting different types of data related to those projects, depending on which expenditure category it falls into. When we're talking about grant administration, that's expenditure category 7.1, I believe. And yeah, it's an activity in and of itself. So no need to report out, by individual. It's more by activity, and grants administration
Activity,
would be
okay.
one activity.
And if we were typically gonna do like the estimate covering, so let's say we lowball, like we haven't spent enough. We can still reclass the obligated funds as long as it's a position before 12/31/24 for personnel or another project that's eligible for ARPA funds, correct?
Correct, and that's part of
Okay.
that flexibility under 17.16. Treasury has made the estimation process available. Just being completely honest with you, I've never done something like that, so I'm not as comfortable with it. So, I'm more comfortable with the interagency agreement process, where I would do, up to $200,000 for grants administration, reporting, single audit, and have that as my obligation. But regardless, Treasury has stated that you'll be able to cover cost increases, cost overruns after 12/31/24. So couple different ways to do it. All of them are fine, whichever you find, administratively the least burdensome for you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Great. And we have a question from Erica.
Sorry, just to clarify real quick. So she mentioned if she lowballs the expense on those positions, she has the ability to shift the money to another allowable position. But do we have the flexibility to move it to another allowable expense or contract from a position? Like, let's just say we established 2 positions. We didn't spend all the money, and we would like to shift the excess money into another program.
Yeah,
Okay.
just be careful not to use the term allowable at this point. Another obligated.
Obligated. Okay.
There are all kinds of things are allowable, but after 12/31/24, if they weren't obligated, then they're off the table. But yeah,
Okay.
certainly you can move money from a project that was obligated that might come in under budget to grants administration or other personnel costs, and vice versa, as long as they're obligated activities.
Okay, perfect. That's a awesome clarification. The other thing, I did kind of send something over to the email, but I just wanted to get clarification from you. Maybe you'll just help me understand it a little bit better. When there's like a statewide pricing agreement that's put in place, let's just say if we're purchasing, I don't know, computers or cases, or, like when the bidding process took place, ARPA wasn't a part of the original RFP process or the contractual process at the beginning, but there was a bidding process that took place, a competitive bidding process that took place, and we would like to branch off of that agreement. Is there any frowned upon like opinions on that? And what do I need to ensure is part of, because it looks like what the city does, what I'm learning coming from state government is that if there's a statewide pricing agreement in place and they want to execute a contract against it, then what we do is we execute a contract against the statewide pricing agreement, which is like an additional contract, but we add any additional language or anything necessary to make it applicable to our contract. But I wasn't sure if it was frowned upon when considering federal funding.
No, it's not frowned upon. And many of these cooperative purchasing programs have been around for years, and the contracts have been around before ARPA was even imagined to be a thing. So whether it's NASPO or trying to think of some of the other ones, but using cooperative purchasing is great. And most cooperative purchasing is done before they issue a blanket contract, a cooperative contract. It's done through some sort of competitive procurement. So just make sure that happened. There are some cooperative purchasing programs out there that don't use competitive procurement. So just ask that question of whoever you're working with. And then the actual PO task order, the document you issue to that vendor, you're correct. That's where you would incorporate any ARPA specific language reporting, you name it. But ARPA did not have to be part of the original RFP, the original competitive purchasing process.
That's super helpful. I was a little overwhelmed to think that it wasn't part of the original process and that was an issue or concern in our procurement unit. Another question I wanted to ask, I know that there's a lot of CFR 200 updates, and that's kind of what I meant on the question that I asked about like any additional disclaimers. I know that with like FAA grants or FTA grants have specific disclaimers that need to be added into their contracts. And so I was just kind of curious if there was any specific disclaimers that need to be added for ARPA related contracts, number one. And number two, probably, and you don't have to answer this in this platform, I know that it's a large audience, but like what type of guidance do you have for entities to include the updated CFR 200 updates into maybe like contractual templates? It's a little overwhelming to see all the updates, and I'm not really sure what's the best way to incorporate it. I mean, there was a suggestion to reference like a link and giving the responsibility of the contractor to reference the link, or are legal to review the link to ensure that those disclaimers are in there. But in some cases, it looks like they actually want to see the disclaimer included in the contractual language.
So the October the recent updates to the uniform guidance take effect for grant awards made after October 1st of 2024. So none of those uniform guidance updates would be applicable to any of your ARPA projects, even out into 25 and 26. It's for awards made after 10/1/24. As far as outside of ARPA grants and incorporating those updates into contract templates, right there with you. I would encourage you and your procurement staff to kind of tap the brakes a little bit, because we're still seeing federal agencies, OMB issues it, but then federal agencies have to adopt them and have an implementation plan. And we still haven't seen all the federal agencies adopt the uniform guidance updates and put their own implementation plan. So I think you are fine to use your current templates for now, but specifically to ARPA, none of that applies because the award was made before 10/1/24.
Super helpful. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Great. Well, unless there's any other questions, I'll just encourage you all as things come up. Sometimes questions percolate in your mind, and you think about them in the middle of the night. And so please do reach out if you have questions. We know that there's a lot of anxiety surrounding the deadlines, and we just want to make sure you feel really well prepared heading into them. And so with that, we'll just close out today. Hope that everyone has a lovely holiday and has a great start to the new year. Thank you all.